point, could I just ask you all to put your video on so that we the Economic Recovery Plan for Australia, and of course to provide you with an opportunity to ask him any questions and provide you with answers. Please welcome the Minister, Minister Tudge.
Well, thanks so much, Alice, and g'day everybody once again. It's nice to see so many of you here at this press conference. I understand that many of you attended the Prime Minister's press conference from a day or two ago, and I don't want to repeat the things which he went through, but I do want to make myself available for any questions or issues or concerns which you may have, and to hopefully address them adequately for you. I did want to start though by at least mentioning 2 or 3 components which you may be particularly interested in. The first, of course, is that I'll just mention that the budget overall is built around trying to get the economy moving again, build confidence and create jobs. And everything is geared towards that end. And we've forecast our figures in these budgets in terms of where we think GDP will be, where we think unemployment will be. But there's some particularly attractive measures in there in relation to business investment. And I just wanted to highlight those to you, knowing that multicultural communities create small businesses at a higher rate than anybody else. And there's some great business initiatives there, 2 in particular that I'll mention. One being that any business now under $5 billion is able to make an investment and write that entire investment off in this financial year. So that's a massive cash flow boost for businesses, and hopefully will be a great incentive for businesses to go out there and invest. The second one though is that, in fact I'll mention 3. The second one being there is a cash loss carryback scheme in place. And what that means is if you're a business and you've made a loss this year, you can offset that loss against last year's profits. So again, you actually get an additional cash flow boost there, and you might even get some of your tax back from last year, which is another great mechanism to support those small businesses. And the third I'll just briefly mention is the incentive for businesses generally to employ particularly younger people, those aged under 30. And if it's a person under 30 who's been on the job seeker payment, then that business will be eligible for $200 per week to go towards the costs of employing that young person. If they're between 30 and 35, then they'll get $100 a week to go towards the cost of employing that young person. So I mentioned those 3 things in particular to go to what might be of interest to business and trying to encourage them to invest, to employ, to get the economy going again. I then wanted to touch with you in introductory comments just in relation to the migration program. And then I want to finally just mention some social cohesion initiatives and then open it up for questions and comments. At budget time, we always outline our permanent migration program. And our permanent migration program for this financial year is again capped at 160,000 people, which is the same cap as last financial year. A couple of important differences though, which I wanted to highlight this year from the permanent migration program. First up, that we've massively boosted the family proportion of the permanent migration program. So almost doubled the number which are available there, and specifically for partner visas, partner permanent residency visas, because we know we've had a lot of applications for that, and most of those people are in Australia already, 75, 80%, and we've got the opportunity to regularise their arrangements, make them permanent residents, and in the not too distant future, hopefully make them great Australians. So that's an important section today in the budget, is almost doubling the number of partner permanent residency visas available in this financial year. And that will hopefully give a lot of confidence and a lot of surety to people who have fallen in love with a foreigner and can make them a permanent resident and subsequently a citizen down the track. Second point I wanted to highlight was that because our overall migration intake will be considerably smaller over this year and the next couple of years, we've really prioritised those groups coming into the country who will be the job-making categories, job-making individuals. And there's two categories in particular that I highlight that we have put additional resources into. Or sorry, I should say that we've put additional places for. One being the Global Talent Scheme visa, where we've tripled that number from 5,000 to 15,000. And this is really for the really high-skilled global super talent, which is out there. And they are permanent residency visas, and they enable a person to come in here and work, obviously, and be a permanent resident straight away. And this we've tripled because they're the type of people that will come in, create businesses, be entrepreneurs, be those tech superstars, be those senior executives, which will really generate jobs here in Australia. And so that's our focus. And then the second category has been the business investors. And I know this is something that I've had questions from many people around this table previously, but we've doubled the number of places available through the business investment program. And so now there'll be 13,500 spots available for this financial year. And for those that don't know, the business investment program is for people who have considerable sums of money that they want to invest in a business, typically in Australia. And we're increasing those numbers because, of course, when they bring in their business and bring in their investments, again, they generate jobs and generate wealth here in Australia, which is, again, our core objective from the budget measures. So they're the two, if you like, within the skilled program where we've really boosted up the numbers there. We'll still also emphasise the general employer-sponsored skilled migration stream, which of course will still be present. There'll still be employers who need to find those skilled people. And we've have that number at 22,000, which is similar to what it has been as well. Many of those people will have already been in the country, of course. They might be on a 4-year visa, and then they transfer into that employer-sponsored permanent residency visa. Finally, I've mentioned the Refugee Program, which in our permanent residency program, as you may know, you have the skilled stream, which I've touched on, the family stream, 90% of which is partner, and then you have your refugee and humanitarian stream. And the refugee and humanitarian stream we've allocated 13,750 positions for, which is just slightly above where the actual outcome was from last year, but is below what the target has been for the last couple of years. And that's in part in recognition that all migration is down, and it is in some respects proportionate to that. So I'll just briefly mention that. Having said that, with the refugee program, we'll still be the third most generous country in absolute numbers in the world with our humanitarian intake. I now just want to touch on the social cohesion pieces and just mention two in particular, and then really hand it over to you for questions, observations. you would have heard me talk about social cohesion in the past. I did a big speech at the National Press Club a month or so ago and outlined several initiatives there. But in the budget, there are additional measures to help support our social cohesion, which is already so strong, the envy of the world in some respects, given the diversity of our population. But there's always challenges on our social cohesion, and this budget just adds additional funding to support that social cohesion. I'll mention three in particular. One being in relation to foreign interference, and just additional measures in place to challenge foreign interference and ensure that our communities stay united. Second, in relation to English language, and prior to the election, but really an election initiative, was the removing any limits on any migrants being able to have English language classes. So that means that regardless of when you came into the country, or how long it takes you to learn the English language, there will be free English language classes for as long as is needed. And we encourage, through you, people whose English may be poor to really take that opportunity, to take advantage of those free English language classes and get your English into a better place. And that's a very important initiative. On top of that, and this has received some mainstream media attention just the last day or two, we've placed a requirements on the permanent resident partner visa to visa applicants to have demonstrated that they've made reasonable efforts to have learnt English before they have their permanent residency visa granted. And what normally occurs is that a person comes into the country on a provisional visa. They will still be able to come into this country on a provisional visa or on any other visa. And it'll be 2 or 3 years before they're eligible to apply for their permanent residency visa. And in that time, we expect them to have taken advantage of the free English language classes and made all reasonable efforts to learn English. They may not get to a functional level. They may only just get to a very, very basic level, and that's not the issue. The issue is we want people to have a real go at trying to learn English before they put their application in, and if they've demonstrated that they've had a proper go, then that visa will be granted as long as the other checks are assured as well. I just wanted to mention that one. And finally, just in terms of supporting social cohesion, on top of some of the other things which we've already announced, there was additional funding for new client liaison officers, which are the people who work with the regional directors in your respective jurisdictions, and to reach out and engage with the community leaders and the multicultural communities. And we've got additional funding there to employ people with particular language skills, in particular with Mandarin, Cantonese, Vietnamese and Arabic. And so that money is there. We're in the recruitment process at the moment. And so if you know good people who want to apply for those positions, then please point them towards those, because that just helps us maintain our engagement. So I'll just, I think, leave it there with my introductory comments. First up, just summarising, talking about the budget as a whole, geared around economic recovery and jobs growth. Second, being around our migration program and supporting a stronger family component, particularly for those who are already in the country, but a real focus on those really high-skilled migrants who will create jobs here in Australia. And then thirdly, some additional social cohesion measures to guarantee our national unity going forward. Despite the fact that it is strong and the envy of the world, we always need to work on it, and this just goes that little bit extra further to support that. I'll leave it there and hand over back to Alice, who I think is going to moderate this session.
Thank you very much.
And take questions from people.
Thank you very much, Minister. The first question comes from Avneet Arora from SBS Punjabi. Please go ahead, Avneet.
Minister, this is Avneet from SBS Punjabi. Let's talk about the migration programming levels. Now, they indicate there's been a sharp decline in the number of places for two categories: skilled independent, which has suffered a 65% drop when you compare it to the 2019 planning levels, and state nominated category, which has suffered a 55% drop when you compare it to the previous year's planning levels. Now, what's the government's rationale behind tripling the intake under a fledgling program like Global Talent Program over general skill migration, which is a popular pathway for international students and also migrants who want to settle in the country permanently? Also, the second question is regarding the English language program for partner visas. How do you define functional English?
So let me address the second question first, Avneet. So the requirements which will be placed onto new partner applicants from the end of next year, so it doesn't apply to any of the applicants who are in process presently, will be that a person has to either have demonstrated that they have functional level English, or that they have to have demonstrated that they've made a reasonable effort while in Australia to learn English. And I was describing what that reasonable effort might be, defined as previously. Effectively, doing your best to sit those free English language classes. If already your English is adequate and clearly don't need English language classes, then you'll just need to demonstrate in a manner which we'll define over the next few months as to how you can prove that you've got functional English. Now, that might be because you've gone to an English-speaking school or university. It might be that you pass an English language test, which is set at a functional level, or it could be another mechanism, and we'll define those over the months ahead. But that will be quite straightforward, obviously, for many people. And then, obviously, if you don't have any English, then we support you to do those free English language classes, and just want you to have a go. Because, and I emphasise this point, we want you to have a go because it's in your interests as an individual. Because if you don't have some basic English, your chances of getting work are very, very small. Your chances of really participating fully in our Australian society are diminished. And of course, it's more difficult to participate in our democracy once you become a citizen. So it's in their interest, but it's also in the public's interest, because we need a common language to be able to communicate with each other. And that's, of course, it's so difficult to integrate if you can't communicate with one another. So that's why this is so important. And it doesn't mean we're not emphasising other languages. It's sensational that people speak multiple languages, and it's a real asset for Australia. But we also have to have this common language that we can share and communicate with, which underpins our social cohesion. Now, in relation to those couple of measures that you pointed out, Avneet, we have dropped down the skilled independent numbers and emphasised the employer-nominated scheme more. And that's because the employment outcomes from the employer-nominated scheme are much higher, almost by definition. But you have to have an employer to be sponsored in, versus the employment outcomes of the general skilled migration scheme aren't particularly great, particularly in those first 18 to 24 months. And then they get better. Having said that, that global talent scheme is effectively a skilled independent scheme, but you have to demonstrate that you've got very significant skills to do that. And some people will be in Australia that apply for that scheme. No, they'll be just fantastic technology people. They'll be great entrepreneurs that they can demonstrate. And so they can take advantage of that. And then in relation to the state and territory nominated scheme, that is typically a function of the demand. And so they put in their bids for it. And we always encourage the states and territories to look closely at that, because it's a great way of getting a a broader distribution of migration across Australia when you have state-nominated ones, because South Australia, they nominate a few thousand, those people go to South Australia and they tend to stick there. Versus if there isn't such a scheme in place, most people tend to gravitate, which we know, to Melbourne and Sydney because they're the most well-known cities.
Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. The next question comes from Roberta Vitello. Please go ahead, Roberta.
Yes, thank you, Minister, for joining us today. Could I just ask you what was the
We just lost you, Roberta.
Apologies, Roberta. Could we please ask you to repeat the question? Unfortunately, we can't hear you, Roberta.
Your sound started.
We
We heard you say your name, and then all of a sudden your sound dropped out.
We'll try to come back to you, Roberta. Raymond Chow. Mr. Chow, could you please unmute yourself at your end and ask your question?
All right. Dear Minister, reviews have indicated that present AMEP English is not effective. Will the Minister consider adopting a model of migrants learning English in the context of building up understanding and commitment to Australian values and the acceptance of multiculturalism? And will you consider opening up more community organizations to provide English courses for migrants other than just AMES?
Yeah, it's a very good question, Raymond, and the answer is yes. I have equally been dissatisfied with the quality of some of the English language providers, and I've initiated a review of the English language provision. And when the contracts come up again, we'll be placing much greater emphasis on outcomes, if you like, rather than just activities. So that will then open it up to other community organisations to be able to offer those classes if they can demonstrate that they can achieve those outcomes. And I'm particularly keen, actually, Raymond, to ensure that there's greater use of technology as well in the English language classes, because technology these days for language provision is brilliant, and it can be very customised to where you are and your native language background compared to a general class. So they're the types of things which we're working on right now. I'll just touch on, Raymond's the values piece as well. I think that's really important too. I mean, I'd love to have some of that incorporated into the English language classes too, but and we'll explore that. But we certainly are placing some greater emphasis generally on the sort of core Australian values which have underpinned our success to date. And we're doing that through updating the citizenship test, which will have a dedicated section on Australian values, updating the Australian values statement, which all migrants, when they come into Australia, will sign. And additionally, we want to place greater emphasis through an ongoing campaign, if you like, in relation to this. And these values that I'm talking about are well-known values to the people around this table. They're freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of association, equality between men and women, parliamentary democracy, all of the key things which have underpinned our success and in part made us so attractive for migrants around the world to come to see. And but we just want to continually emphasise those things to new people coming into the country.
So, Minister, you agree that good in English and to be a good Australian are both important targets for this program?
Sorry, Raymond, I didn't quite catch that.
So do you agree that, both good in English for work and good in English, to be a good Australian are the two targets for this program combined together?
I hear you. I think that we want people to share our common values, and indeed most people come out to Australia because they do want to share our values, but we've got to emphasise that. And I think, as we were discussing, and I share your view, Raymond, that you need to have at least a basic understanding of English because it's very difficult to get work. I can tell you only 13% of people with no English are in a job. Only 13%. And it's different. It often gets put to me. They say to me, you know, well, my parents, you know, it's often some of the Greeks and the Italians, I sort of say, well, my parents came out in the 50s, no English, they got work straight away, they're model citizens now. That's no doubt the case. Back in the 50s and 60s, you could go straight into work without any English. Today, you can't do that because of the occupational health and safety rules and the like. The labour force has changed very remarkably. And so even with those entry-level labouring positions, you still need a basic grasp of English to understand the occupational health and safety standards. So anyway, Brad, thank you.
Thank you, Minister. The next question comes from Cecil Huang. Please go ahead, Cecil.
Yeah, thank you. Minister Tudge, just on the new language requirements, there are concerns this would discourage people to come to Australia at a time when we really need new migrants to boost our economy. What's your response to this?
I disagree with this. I think that Australia will always be an attractive destination for millions of people around the world. And I actually think that Australia will be a more attractive destination as a result of how well we have managed the pandemic, both from a social perspective and an economic perspective, relative to our countries that we typically compete with for migrants, you know, the United States, England, Canada, New Zealand, etc. So I don't agree with your statement. Moreover, people will be able to come into the country without any English language requirements at all, because as I was explaining before, you have to come in as a provisional permanent resident to start with, if not come in under a different visa, which means you're here already for 2 to 3 years before you're able to get that permanent residency visa. So you're already in the country. And it's in that 2 to 3 years that we're simply asking, in a not unreasonable way, that if you want to stay as a permanent resident to become a citizen, you've got to make a reasonable effort to learn the English language.
Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. The next question comes from Stephanie G from Vision China Times. Please go ahead, Stephanie.
Thank you. So our question is, as the Australian citizenship test now includes questions on Australian values, new Chinese migrants believe this is unnecessary and a political move due to the situation of the Australian and China relations. Should the government be doing more promotions to let more people understand the reason Australian values are included in the citizenship test? And our second question is, as Australian and China relations go into a standoff, the Chinese community is gradually becoming more and more silent and less active compared to before. Would the government consider any initiatives to help the Chinese come out of the shadows and participate more in the public life?
Two interesting questions. Let me deal with the second one first. I mean, the Australian Chinese community is well over 1 million people and is intricately involved in every single aspect of Australian life. And we even have now a member of the federal parliament who was born in Hong Kong and is Australian citizen, member of the federal parliament, the member for Chisholm, right next door to my electorate. So I don't agree with the proposition that the Australian Chinese community are not engaged in Australian life. To the contrary, I think I can't imagine Australia today without the Australian Chinese community because it's such an intricate part of it. I would say, though, in relation to the general relationship with China, that, and I may have made this point before, that we maintain the strongest ever trade relationship with China that we've ever had. We maintain the strongest ever people-to-people linkages with China that we've ever had, and in part because of the huge Australian Chinese community here. And sometimes we have disagreements on a strategic level with China, but those disagreements, we'll manage them, we'll work through them sensibly, and we'll be consistent in our position in line with Australian values. But what I would say is that any difference that we have with the Chinese Communist Party government is completely separate to the Australian Chinese community. The Australian Chinese community, as I was saying, they've been a part of Australia in significant numbers going back to the 1850s. And they've been in very significant numbers, obviously, in the last 20 or so years. So I just wanted to make that point. Second, in relation to the values question, the values questions are in part because it's a shift away from having technical questions, if you like, or general knowledge questions in the citizenship test, to placing at least more emphasis on Australian values. And in part because we have an increasing number of people who come from countries which don't always have a similar set of values to Australia's values. And it's an emphasis of what our values are and the importance of them. And the fact that those values actually underpin our success. The freedom of speech and association, the parliamentary democracy, equality of men and women, those equal opportunities, regardless of race, gender, and diversity. And not every country shares all of those things. And so we specifically are emphasising them. They're not controversial to most people. When I've explained to them what the values are, people sort of look at me as if, what's the big deal? They just take these things for granted. But we're just trying to emphasise those so that we maintain those values. We continue to talk about them, and we emphasise those to people coming in that, this is what Australia's being built on.
Thank you, Minister. The next question comes from Zhao Bang from ABC News Asia Pacific Newsroom. Please go ahead. We can't hear you, unfortunately. We might need to come back to you, sir, because we can see you. We just can't hear you. Minister, the next question comes from Fred Zhang from Melbourne Today.
Hi, Alan. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you, Fred.
Thank you. It's good to see you again, Alan. So my first question is, United States have recently banned Chinese Communist Party members from acquiring permanent residency or citizenship. As we are the closest ally of US, do we have similar plans on CCP members living in Australia or CCP members who are applying for permanent residency or citizenship?
That's not part of our plans, and it certainly hasn't come across my desk.
Okay. The second question is, if a new immigrant became Australian citizen, but later did something against our Australian value, would his or her citizenship get stripped, like terrorism or something?
If you're a citizen, was the question, if you're a citizen,
yeah,
could your citizenship get stripped?
Yeah.
Certainly, I'll answer the question directly. Certainly, if you are a permanent resident, if you are any visa holder, including a permanent resident, which is a visa at the end of the day, then obviously those visas can be revoked. Now, very, very rare for a permanent residency visa to be revoked. We frequently revoke temporary resident visa holders, and basically for criminal activity, and that would certainly include terrorism. In relation to citizenship, the citizenship issue is more complex. Where you have dual citizenship, we will sometimes seek to revoke that citizenship if a person has engaged in serious terrorism incidences. It's more difficult if they're only a citizen of Australia and have no citizenship elsewhere, because then you come across the international non-refoulement obligations. So from memory, we had legislation in the Parliament just recently in relation to that question. It wasn't Peter Dutton was dealing with this rather than me, so apologies for not having the details at hand, but we can get those details to you, Fred.
Thank you, Minister.
Thank you, Minister. The next question comes from Moti Visa. Please go ahead.
Yeah, my question which I have written there, that most of the factories, they are run by the workers, they don't know much English. So I don't feel that it is really required for them to speak English, because I have worked as a factory manager in various places in Australia. So is it compulsory for them as well?
I suppose I'd say, Modi, that I look at the data, and the data is absolutely compelling. That, and this is from the Australian Bureau of Statistics data, that only 13% of those people without English are in jobs. Only 13%. Now, if you've got good English, that figure rises to 64% of the working age population. So it's an extraordinary difference. I know of actually no other factor which has such a strong correlation to employment outcomes as the ability to speak English in Australia. And as I said, that has changed over time because of largely because of occupational health and safety rules, which means that, and there's fewer of those real entry-level labouring jobs available as well, which makes it so much more important. Still some people obviously are working without English language skills, but it's so much harder. But it's not just employment. The success of Australia has been built on inviting people to our shores and migrants becoming central to Australian life. But you can really only be central to Australian life if you can fully participate in it, and you can only fully participate in it if you have at least a basic grasp of English.
Okay.
Thank you.
Second thing I should ask, that is it applicable only to the partners or parents as well?
It applies to only to the partners, and only to partners of working age. So most of the parents who come in are elderly, and we're not placing any expectations upon those people. Now, of course, we would, if they plan on staying here for a long period of time, of course we would encourage them to take up some of these free English language classes. But there's no expectation and no obligation as such. You've got to remember that for the spousal visa, the partner visa, that typically is in your mid-20s that visa is given. So you've got a long period of time that you're going to be in Australia, and a long period of your working life that you'll be in Australia. And hence that little nudge for people to make that reasonable effort to do those English language classes. I would say too, Modi, that this is a very important measure for women, because there are some instances whereby the husband may not want his partner to be learning English, and sometimes for control reasons, and that is not consistent with Australian values. In Australia, every man and woman has the opportunity to fully participate in our society, including getting a job.
Thank you, Minister. There is one last question, which is on the citizenship. Now, we know the voting is compulsory in this country for all the citizens, but it's not compulsory to register as a voters in the voters list to all the citizens. So why it's so different?
You've got me there, Moti. I don't know the answer to that question, but I'm happy to get back to you on that, because I don't think you do get fined as such, do you, if you don't register to vote? But you certainly may get fined if you don't vote. I don't know the answer to that question. But let's dig that up and we'll get back to you, maybe.
Thank you, Minister. The next question comes from Masiki Acharya from SBS Hindi. Please go ahead, Masiki.
Hi, my question today is that the budget papers say there will be a focus on onshore applicants. Could you point out the exact visas where these onshore applicants will be prioritized?
So the greater focus, particularly in that family stream, actually, which is mainly partner visas. So out of the entire family stream, about 90% is typically partner visas, and the rest tends to be parents. We're predicting that probably 75 to 80% of those will be onshore, because that's where most of them are already here in Australia. I'm getting a bit of feedback on this. I don't know if you are, Alice, as well. No.
Yes, we're just trying to mute from my end.
Okay. So that's the main one. We're going to have it's in part, Masiki, that because we'll have fewer people coming into the country, we're placing greater priority on making permanent residents those who are already here. Now, and because we have the spaces available, if you like, and the reason why we have fewer people coming into the country, of course, is because of the pandemic and the speed limit being the quarantine levels that we have in place. So consequently, actually, when you actually look at what's called the net overseas migration figure, we will actually have this financial year, for the first time in 75 years, more people leaving the country than coming into the country in terms of that net overseas migration figure. So we're trying to regularise more people in Australia, if you like, and hence that emphasis there.
Thank you, Minister. The next question comes from Rajesh Sharma from Indus Age. Please go ahead, Rajesh.
Thank you, Alice. Minister, this is regarding the business investment visa. My question is Department going to accept business visa application than interim critical skill list as announced earlier?
You were breaking up a bit to me there, Rajesh. I couldn't quite catch. I don't know, Alice, if you could hear that. I think it was your line which was slightly breaking up.
Yes, I think your question was in relation to business visas. Rajesh, could I just ask you to repeat your question, please, and we'll see if we can hear better.
Is Department going to accept business visa applications other than interim critical skill list that has announced earlier?
So the business investment, the Business Innovation Investment Program is a separate program to the employer-sponsored or the General Skilled Migration Program, which is both based on a skills list. The Business Investment and Innovation Program is not based on a skills list. There's particular sub-elements to it, and effectively you need to demonstrate that you have a certain amount of money to invest, or that you may have had some business experience and demonstrate that in order to be eligible for that. Now, we'll be making some changes to that Business Investment Innovation Investment Program as well, and I'll be announcing those later this year, which won't take effect though until sometime next year, so there's plenty of advance notice.
Thank you, Minister.
I'll just get back. I've just had texted to me in relation to one of the previous questions that it actually is compulsory by law to enrol to vote as much as it is to vote, and that's outlined on Section 101 of the Electoral Act.
Thank you, Minister. Minister, we had a question earlier from Roberta Vitello. Roberta, are we able to hear you now? Are you back online? No, we can't hear Roberta, but Roberta has sent her question through. What was the thought behind introducing the English language requirement for partner visas, and how is it relevant to family violence?
The reason for it is because we already have an English language requirements on all of the skilled visas. Every single primary applicant through the skilled stream has to pass an English language test to get into the country. And the largest category that then doesn't have any English language requirement is in the family stream, and 90% of the family stream is on the partners. And we know that there are considerable numbers that come in and become permanent residents without any English language capability. It was brought, in part, this is brought to my attention by looking at the data again as well, and that we've had a massive increase over the last decade or so of people who can't speak any English in the country. And today we estimate there's probably about 1 million people in Australia who have no English, or English is very, very poor, which is more than double what it was just 10 or so years ago. So now that does start to put a little bit of pressure on our social cohesion as well. But equally, from an employment perspective, and I mentioned this again, the partners come in their mid-20s, and we want them to be fully involved in Australian life if they're going to be here as permanent residents and citizens. And it's so difficult to do that if you don't have at least a basic command of English. And hence that requirement, and I don't think an unreasonable one, to say, just have a go at learning English. We're not going to hold you to account for how fast you learn, but we do want you to have a reasonable effort to learn that English language so that you can fully participate in Australian life.
Thank you, Minister.
Oh, sorry, she asked me about the violence against women as well. So in some respects, because if you have command of the English language, you're much more likely and have an ability to be able to reach out and get additional assistance and engage more broadly with some of the community groups. And it's one of the reasons why the head of the Australian Muslim Women's Association, for example, is so strong on this, but equally other women. We'll have more to say too about domestic violence in this regard over the next week or so in terms of other measures which we've put in place here, and I'll inform you about that too.
Thank you, Minister. The next question comes from Umesh Chandra from Brisbane Indian Times and Australian Indian Radio. Please go ahead,
Umesh. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, thank you.
Oh, thank you. Okay, Minister. Well, once again, I would like to make a comment rather than a question, and I must commend you on this move. And previously, as a People of Australia ambassador, we used to go out and get this message out to the community about the language and the language skills. I think it is timely, and I think it's a move moving forward. And of course, as the president of Queensland Multicultural Council as well, we had a meeting, and this topic was discussed. So there's always both sides of the equation, but I can see where you are coming from, Minister, and I think it's very timely. We can learn from the other countries where the language becomes a big problem otherwise, unless there is a uniformity and the emphasis placed on at least the willingness to learn the English, and which is of course being provided as a free course. I commend you on that. And of course, on domestic violence, I'm part of White Ribbon Queensland Committee as the vice chair, and English language there will of course make a difference when it comes to reporting and when it is reaching out. Because by the time people reach out to an interpreter and by the time they get to the police, it becomes a little bit late as well. So I think it's a good move. It's not a question, but just my comment and observation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Umesh. I very much appreciate those comments.
Minister, the next question comes from Brian Go from Australia China Daily. Please go ahead, Brian.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Touch. Well, I have a question concerning about the international students. You see, and the border at the moment is still closed, and in future it seems that the pandemic still have a great effect, not only in Australia but also around the other side of the world. And I wonder if the government in this budget still have some about about some long-term strategic plan to introduce more policies to let more international students to come from China and from other countries to Australia to stimulate. Also, the university at the moment is getting very and is also struggling. The higher education sector is struggling. They need students to come here, and so I wonder if the government has some very good plans, some strategies to introduce more students to come here, like give them more visa policies or some other good policies to introduce them to come. Thank you.
So this budget itself does not have anything to say about international students, and in part because the budget lays out the framework for the permanent residency program only. It doesn't deal with the temporary residency program, which is dealt with separately through policy. And
the budget is focused on the job creating and the revival of the economy of Australia.
Yeah, that's right. But also from a migration program perspective, the budget only lays out the parameters and the numbers for the permanent residency program, whereas international students are under a temporary resident visa, and we dealt with those on an ongoing basis. We do want to get the international student market back up and running though, and we're working hard in terms of trying to at least get some pilots up in South Australia and the ACT. I think, Brian, that but for the challenges in Victoria with quarantine, we probably would have had this up and running by now. But that that obviously put a spanner in the works. Nobody's coming into Victoria at the moment under the quarantine arrangements. They've got limited spots available in other states and territories, and we're trying to put a bit of pressure on the states to lift those quarantine numbers, which most of are agreeing to. But that becomes, if you like, the speed limit on people coming in. And we've still got Australians who are seeking to come into the country as well. So it's just Brian, I understand that need. International students have been fantastic for the Australian economy, for the Australian society, and many students have gone on to become fantastic citizens. And so we do want to get this up and running again. I can't tell you though exactly when.
It may take more time to decide and to see through this great uncertainty.
Yeah. It is, and obviously if a vaccine is found and it's globally available, then we'll be able to very quickly get back to normal. But until that time, we'll have to have these quarantine arrangements in place, and then that does become the speed limits, if you like, on how many people can come into the country. It also impacts on people leaving the country, of course, temporarily. Australians leaving the country because they want to, visit a loved one overseas. While you can apply for an exemption for compassionate grounds, and those are given in their tens of thousands, there's no regular, at the moment, there still isn't an open border in that regard, because by definition, if you go out for a particular reason, you'll want to come back and you get the speed limit of the quarantine arrangements again. It's a challenge. This pandemic is a very significant challenge. We've got great control of it here in Australia, apart from in Victoria, which is getting under control now. But most other countries don't. and it makes
business
it
sector
challenging.
is really struggling to.
Thank you, Minister. I think that brings time for questions to a close. Would you like to make any closing remarks?
I don't think so, Alice. Just thanks again for everybody participating in this, and I'll continue to hold these regularly, particularly after we've got more significant announcements, which might be of direct relevance to the multicultural communities, above and beyond the normal announcements which we make. But thanks for your attendance, thanks for your questions, and we'll look forward to seeing you soon.
Thank you, Minister. Thanks, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Alice.